It was a cold March day. A smoggy overcast laid on top of Moscow. Red Square and the Soviet Union was silent. For these few moments, the roaring steam engine of the progress of the Soviet Union halted, and only the breath of thousands of onlookers could be heard. Suddenly, the chimes of the Kremlin clock echoed throughout Moscow's streets.
12 часов.
Cannons fired, and the anthem played. Throughout the Soviet Union and all of its associated countries, shadowed faces lay silent in the streets. From Berlin to Moscow, to the far stretches of Central Asia and the Far East, all the people could do was be silent. Joseph Stalin was dead. The man who seemingly accelerated the country from vast expanses and small villages to a leading country on the world stage now was gone. A grim reaper to some, and a father to others. To many citizens, he was the only leader they had ever known. Headed by Stalin, the country of 120 million people, from all walks of life and ethnicities, listened to the sound of silence. He had mobilized a disconnected country into the unit that would stop the greatest evil in the history of the world. But many wondered, will the future bring progress? Will the future bring religious freedom? Will the future bring good yield? Or will the future bring me into nuclear annihilation? Just like that, the mute government announced his death, and the future of this locomotive lay in the balance of a new man. Ultimately, the answer to these questions was never found. However, by the end of it all, one man had overtaken the thousands of party members racing to fill the void of Stalin's position: Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, in these early years, was largely approached with support. Rooted in a working-class family, many were in the dark at what his plans for the country were. And late in the evening of February 25th, 1956, he would awaken the party to the great trial before them. Hello and welcome back to the channel. I wanted to give my apologies for being inactive over the course of 2023. Just like the governments we will learn of today, I can promise change, but the reality is I don't know where I will steer the channel in upload frequency. Nonetheless, this is a hobby, and I have carried it throughout undergrad and will continue indefinitely, so stay tuned. I also wanted to openly state that this video is biased. I know many of you come for that quick learning fix, and you will get it, but I must warn all of you interested in history that the sources I chose, no matter how much I try to be non-biased, are biased. In fact, the whole series has bias. For one, I chose the traditional German-to-German comparison of East versus West Germany, instead of analyzing them as two units of the same whole, that were once entangled in cultural and political messes. The years covered today may not be interesting, but understand this episode is vital in understanding the incredible garbage fire to come. Also, I will attempt to add subtitles given viewer feedback. I apologize if you find my narration hard to understand, or dull for that matter. Asking someone who writes history to speak about it in this formal way has become a skill of its own. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the video. February 24th, 1956 was a frigid winter night in Moscow. Towards the end of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, all the politicians within Moscow were tired from the some 10 days of political discussion and debate about the future of the post-Stalin nation. As many communist leaders, politicians, and journalists headed to bed in their hotels and apartments along the roads of Moscow, some got word of something brewing. That night, select delegates were called to a surprise late-night meeting that would go deep into the night. Delegates knew it was big, and dropped their teapots and bedsheets, and like an infestation of gnats, took to the streets in their black Volgas. The quiet, somber winter streets were broken by the distinct roar of government engines. Surely citizens wondered what emergency had befallen the Union. A few hundred trusted communists entered the Great Hall of the Kremlin. Chatter erupted. Poles discussed the absurdity of the night call. Russian diplomats talked about the days prior, and East Germans sat quietly. Suddenly, the stocky man from Kursk entered the hall to speak, and silence fell. Each closely trusted communist eager to hear what emergency had erupted in the USSR. The speech started with discussions on Lenin, a classic trope of any good communist speech. However, Nikita Khrushchev started to bring up the man who must not be named, who only 3 years ago spoke in the same hall. This man being Joseph Stalin. The replacement, Nikita Khrushchev, began to list out Stalin's crimes throughout his almost 3 decades of leadership. Khrushchev's so-called secret speech on February 25th, 1956, began.
Stalin, on the other hand, used extreme methods and mass repressions at a time when the revolution was already victorious, when the Soviet state was strengthened, when the exploiting classes were already liquidated, and socialist relations were rooted solidly in all phases of national economy, when our party was politically consolidated and had strengthened itself both numerically and ideologically. It is clear that here Stalin showed in a whole series of cases his intolerance, his brutality, and his abuse of power. Instead of proving his political correctness and mobilizing the masses, he often chose the path of repression and physical annihilation, not only against actual enemies, but also against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party and the Soviet government. Here, we see no wisdom, but only a demonstration of the brutal force which had once so alarmed Vladimir Lenin.
Imagine for a moment your whole life, your job, family, hobbies, all surrounded dedication to one man, Joseph Stalin. At birth, you were born under a picture of him. Throughout your school, you learned his speeches and triumphs. And throughout your career, you did everything to appease his political structure. Throughout your life, you heard of party members taken away, but you always stuck to your roots. Now, one of Stalin's most trusted advisors is telling you in this stuffy hall that Stalin was liquidating parties like a madman, ignoring threats by Germany before World War II, and partially to blame for the millions of brothers and sisters who died young due to his own cult of personality. What would you be feeling in this moment? At 3 a.m. that same night, First Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party of East Germany was awoken from his slumber in Moscow. Walter Ulbricht, the man we discussed extensively in the previous 2 videos, was advised by East German communists who attended Khrushchev's so-called secret speech. Many notable communists in the hall fainted, felt ill, and often celebrated what was some 3 decades of silence broken. The game was over. Walter Ulbricht, who was one of the strongest leaders within East Germany, had been one of the most hardline Stalinists of the entire Soviet sphere of influence. Not only in ideology, but at the front line with the West, Ulbricht did everything to secure communism as the way of life within his borders, which made even hardline communists shudder. However, Ulbricht stayed relatively quiet after being briefed until simply saying in his high-pitched, squeaky Leipzig accent, "Feel free to say that Stalin is no longer a classic." Ulbricht, who just like Stalin had a strong cult of personality, began to change street names, reorient history, and break down DDR connections with Stalin. The man who for most of his adult career was appeasing Stalin, more so than virtually all hardline leaders of communist countries, dropped his support of Stalin overnight. Ulbricht was just recovering from the shock that rocked the nation to its core, the 1953 uprising, which caused him and leader Wilhelm Pieck to be hospitalized in 1954 due to mental challenges. 1953 completely reshuffled and checked the power of authority within East Germany. 1953 alone caused a mass labor shortage due to the hundreds of thousands of citizens leaving the DDR, as they left with future children that would uphold the nation. East Germany was still headed by Wilhelm Pieck, who in his older age was the original crafter of the East German project all the way back in 1945. To his hip was Ulbricht, who for now was the head of the dominating party of East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party, or SED. The SED was the state organ, so increasingly Ulbricht was becoming the true leader of the country. As covered extensively in the previous video, reforms were put into place quickly to quell the fire of revolution present in East Germany during 1953. By June of 1953, East Germany was on the new course. This fresh economic policy reduced work quotas, increased support for private businesses, and supported workers' rights. The new course aimed at overcoming the troubles present in the citizens' revolt in 1953. East Germans, as was common, started to breathe for a short period of time. They could go on vacation down the River Spree, or go up to the North Sea to work through a crate of Berliner Weisse. To quote Khrushchev, Germans absolutely cannot live without sausage and beer. Even Ulbricht was proud of his breath of post-Stalin fresh air, stating, "When I walk through the streets and see something new and beautiful, I am proud of it. My friend did that. My friend, the plan." Beyond Ulbricht's enthusiasm after the death of Stalin and following his new course, he seemed to be questioning how long this really could be sustainable if the DDR ever wanted to meet the work that would be needed to meet the West, who was fueling millions into the West German economy. Mixed over fears of American spies, which was a very real threat, and becoming too liberalized, Ulbricht increased Volkspolizei and volunteer auxiliary numbers, which costed the country over 11% of its GDP. For the country struggling to meet the needs of its people, such a high percent dedicated to military services started to seem absurd. Despite the fresh air following the new course, police started to pop up on farms, factories, and especially in clubs, and auxiliaries started to show up around street corners and in small cafes. So going into 1956, just as Ulbricht heard the secret speech, he started to mobilize the second five-year plan in July of that year. With the Soviet Union dropping a nuke in 1955 for the first time, Ulbricht began to rewrite his new course. He wanted the DDR to develop mechanization and advanced technologies, such as the development of nuclear energy. This obviously shot work quotas back up after the new course, but hopefully it would bring the prosperity that Ulbricht dreamed of, which would fly his country past the West. You may be wondering too, this crackdown on workers' rights seems very different to the liberalization going on within all areas of the Soviet Union during the de-Stalinization period, or thaw, or even what East Germany had just went through during the new course. And you would be right. Ulbricht, who had promised to drop his Stalinist ideas, whose entire government was appointed by Stalinist officials, was still riding the horse of Stalinism. Propaganda continued to be plastered on street walls, every stamp had Ulbricht's face on it, and the dream of enjoying those cold beers under the warm spring sun was fading rapidly. It seemed Ulbricht had not changed, and Moscow had taken notice. Around the Soviet sphere, things were starting to let up in different ways. Obviously, capitalism was not the goal, but hopefully without Stalin, some third way could be achieved that would make everyone happy. There was one man in particular, who in the back of the room watched Ulbricht closely. Out of everyone, Ernst Wollweber was the outsider. The Soviets forced Wollweber into the head of the Stasi after the 1953 uprising, and the man who fled Germany to join the USSR had been a part of every sabotage effort anywhere involving the USSR. The man was smart, and very close to the Kremlin's orders. He recognized that Ulbricht, despite pleas from Moscow, was not following the guidelines set by the Kremlin to de-Stalinize. Wollweber quickly grew close to men like Karl Schütterwang and big names like Walter Janke, Gerhard Ziller, and Wolfgang Harrach. These men, and the men and women of certain areas of the party and country, started to pressure the SED to liberalize. To liberalize meant to reach the third way and do away with the Stalinist ideas and politics involving a cult of personality. This grew to a critical point going into the fall of 1956, where a significant portion of politicians seemed to approach the idea of a so-called third way between Stalinism and more capitalist-based ideologies. Third way had been a long-forming seed, but now with pressure all over the Soviet bloc, a lot of pressure was applied to East Germany and nearby countries to change under presumed Kremlin orders. It must be noted, however, the liberalization of these countries was not a term fully understood by everyone equally, as we have already seen between the disconnect between the third way within the Soviet Union under Khrushchev and the third way with Ulbricht in the DDR. Obviously, capitalism was not the goal, especially for the Soviet Union. But the third way hoped to allow for more fluidity and freedoms under some sort of socialist or even communist system. Again, the definition was not defined. In communist Hungary, Imre Nagy decided to plant the seed of peace, to give his people a better life and rethink the Stalinist policies into a more liberalized approach, at least as he understood it at the speech in Moscow that same year. However, Nagy made a fatal mistake. Hungary, like most nations in the bloc, had a large population of citizens yearning for independence, And so Naje decided to really appeal to his people and applied to leave the Warsaw Pact on the 1st of November 1956. However, the Soviet Union was not yet about to embrace sunshine and rainbows. To Moscow, Hungary was leaving its reins, and a full-on revolution erupted. Within 12 days, the Hungarian Revolution had concluded. Thousands of Hungarians were dead, mostly liberalized socialists, and the USSR had sent in thousands of tanks. It was a massacre, with innocent Hungarians being exiled in the hundreds of thousands. Naje was eventually caught, sentenced to death through a shady trial, and hung, only to be found face down, buried in a distant corner of a graveyard, tied by barbed wire. The message to the Soviet sphere had been sent. Despite the plans for a thaw, it was clear to Moscow that they had gone too far. Khrushchev, who was still Stalin's closest ally back in the 40s, realized here that they had put the future of the bloc into question. To Ulbricht, this was his moment. He refused, more so than most leaders, to even bite at the liberalization bait, no matter how many people in his party or country wanted it. Now his strong stance against reform in some ways validated his cult of personality. This is not meant to make Ulbricht seem smarter than the rest, but his ignorance paid off. He then looked at his own party, Szydawong, Janke, Zilla, Harich, and the Stasi head Wollweber. All had some part to play in wanting to challenge Ulbricht's policies. On one hand, Ulbricht had the excuse he needed to cleanse the party. On the other, he probably did have a valid reason to see that his Stalinist rule may be challenged in the future. Out of fear of a Stalinist-type purge, by 1957, 60% of politicians from 1952 did not attempt to resume their position. Wollweber, the one man who could speak against Ulbricht because of his connection in Moscow, was incredibly ill during the period of the Hungarian Revolution. Thus, Ulbricht practically had free reign. The third way was over. Harich and Janke were sent to prison. Zilla, under immense stress, took his life. And now, with proper reason, Ulbricht's quote-unquote challenge, Wollweber, was forced to resign in 1957, alongside many other politicians. The end of the thaw is a period often missed in some Soviet histories, but in the case of East Germany, it was only the beginning. The flirtations with liberalization came to a close under Ulbricht's reign for good. Sure, people could still live happy lives, but trust in the government and its system was waning once more. And in only a decade, Ulbricht himself would be looked at as too liberal. Erich Honecker, the future leader of the DDR, once stated, "He who attacks Walter Ulbricht attacks the party." And Erich Honecker would be the future person to criticize Ulbricht's liberal policies. I hope that gets you excited for the episodes to come. However, although you would think everything was headed downhill, by the early 60s, just after the purge, income had doubled from 1953. And although hours and quotas raised, people were able to get access to housing or see their local town get new parks, concert halls, public theaters, and more. For a short period, around 1957 and 58, hope for liberalization may have died, but the people were content to have consistency in their personal life. And as the people enjoyed a short period of calmness after the purge, Ulbricht was still planning to go further in his crackdown against the people. And I use the term Stalinism and liberalization liberally, but as you may have noticed, Ulbricht was on his own path of communism that really doesn't have a definition. To go further into his new course, Ulbricht and the government wanted to once again reimagine what the people should act like, think like, and carry out on a day-to-day basis. With a victory over oppositional politics and the economy, Ulbricht proclaimed the 10 Commandments of socialist morality and ethics. This scripture was meant to outline the conditions of the new socialist man. They laid out the duties of not only the average worker, but how they should treat their family and educate the next generation of East Germans that would hopefully continue the socialist mission. The idea of the new socialist man is rooted in the Soviet Union's new Soviet man, the peak archetyped socialist who dedicated their life to the Soviet organ and would carry the country into the sky. Although these principles may seem useless, and they were to many people, they still displayed the extent at which Ulbricht was willing to go to prevent tides of liberalization. Nonetheless, people worked insane hours, and quotas seemingly never stopped rising. On top of the 10 Commandments, Ulbricht pushed a 7-year plan in 1959 that wanted to push the country incredibly hard, hoping to overtake the West. He knew there would be resulting unrest, and the time for pleasing the people was coming to a close, especially if he ever had hoped to achieve a true country of communism. So, when the Ten Commandments were released to the public in 1958, some people were admittedly irked by the Ten Commandments. At this point, people's kids, especially those in the FDJ, or Talman PNS, were fed information about being a socialist citizen and watching out for the invisible enemy. Things were slowly shifting beneath the feet of the average citizen. With the elimination of opposition and Wilhelm Pieck's death in 1960, after a long decline, Ulbricht had more control than ever. And this isn't solely to blame Ulbricht, as many politicians were perfectly on board with these operations, especially a man named Erich Honecker, who got his position in the Ministry of State Security, or Stasi, after the removal of Wollweber. And if you weren't paying attention, remember Honecker, for he will be the head of the Stasi for the rest of the existence of East Germany. Nonetheless, the shift towards Stalinism, good economic times, and the relatively low emigration rates made the hidden apparatus of the party eager to make a move before the country collapsed out of control of the party. At any moment, the country could return to 1953, or God forbid, turn into Hungary in 1956. It was head of Stasi, Erich Honecker, who in 1958 sent out a secret operation in the middle of the logging areas north of Berlin. Berlin was dramatically heating up at this time due to the Berlin Crisis, which was a series of exchanges and failed negotiations to solve the Berlin question of what status Berlin should have between East and West Germany. Erich Honecker and the Stasi wanted to remove the vital organs of the party outside the city in the case of an attack or uprising. The quiet forest just north of the city was the beginning of something called the Waldsiedlung, a secret village which housed all head politicians, including Walter Ulbricht. The existence of the Waldsiedlung was not known until rumors spread decades later. Locals did notice, but could only think about what was happening in the mysterious zone, patrolled 24/7 by the Stasi. This was the brain and fallout shelter of Walter Ulbricht, Erich Honecker, as well as Erich Honecker, the now party security secretary of the DDR, amongst many other Central Party members. Together, this brain, who were all senior party members, dictated the future of the DDR. Although the people had no idea, the Waldsiedlung marked the physical beginning of the decades to follow, as the country, headed by one man, was in it for the long haul, no matter what bickering may happen under his rule or whatever tensions blow up in the outside world. On top of this, the disaster of liberalization and subsequent changes in the party resulted in Ulbricht's fear of a coup or uprising. Thus, the Waldsiedlung offered the Central Command full access to spy on every conversation going on between top officials within the Waldsiedlung, making a challenge to power impossible, or at least very difficult. With the Waldsiedlung being operational by 1960, the Stasi decided to create new guard units, patrols, watchtowers, surveillance in a large system of walls. It was the preparation for the horrors to come to the some 17 million residents of the DDR. Ulbricht probably knew that the East German world may not last long. Despite changes in immigration, thousands upon thousands of doctors, students, workers, farmers, policemen, and soldiers had fled the country and once again started another exodus. As global tensions rose, there was a growing panic, and people started to fear that they would be caught in a dying country with no exit. This fear, arising amongst the people, gave rise to the German word Torschlusspanik, literally panic that the door will be closed. The 1960s brought failed negotiations with the West, and East Germany now housed the first Soviet nukes outside the country, a mysterious economy, and a changing social system. There was definitely a brewing cause for concern among the people, 80% of whom left via the city that was at the center of it all, Berlin. Berlin, by 1960 and 1961, was the center of the world, where East met West, and where the question of if Germany could remain divided seemed more unlikely than ever. To Ulbricht, the man who shifted the country into this new path after 1956, Berlin was only trouble. And the people became very wary how Ulbricht would crack down on it. To understand Berlin, which deserves a series on its own. I'll let Walter Ulbricht explain the situation to you in 1961.
Herr Frankfurter Rundschau. Herr Vorsitzender, bedeutet die Bildung einer freien Stadt Ihrer Meinung nach, dass die Staatsgrenze am Brandenburger Tor errichtet wird? Und sind Sie entschlossen, dieser Tatsache mit allen Konsequenzen Rechnung zu tragen?
Ich verstehe Ihre Frage so, dass es Menschen in Westdeutschland gibt, die wünschen, dass wir die Bauarbeiter der Hauptstadt der DDR mobilisieren, um eine Mauer aufzurichten, ja? Mir ist nicht bekannt, dass solche Absicht besteht, dass sich die Bauarbeiter in der Hauptstadt hauptsächlich im Wohnungsbau beschäftigen und ihre Arbeitskraft dafür voll ausgenutzt wird, voll eingesetzt wird. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten.
Walter Ulbricht, the now major leader of East Germany, had perceived that time was running out. Increased emigration numbers, rising tensions with the West, and some sort of paranoia exemplified by rising numbers of Stasi members. He made his fatal decision to close the center of the Western world, Berlin, on the rainy night of August 12th and into the 13th. Just like the secret speech laid out by Khrushchev, the night was host to the roar of government engines. For now, the first strips of barbed wire were being laid on the critical points within Berlin. The people, all 17 million, were now being locked in. The previous panic of the people was now justified. Ulbricht had lied and sealed off the country from the rest of the world for good.